How far can a dog's loyalty truly go? For an entire year, Ghost has been a silent shadow at Raymond's side, sharing in the grief of losing Elena. But today, beside her grave, it suddenly snaps its leash and rushes toward a strange little boy. The child, showing no fear, wraps his arms around the dog and whispers a name that only Raymond and his late wife should have known. What secret was buried with Elena? And why is this creature of pure loyalty the only key to unlocking a truth potentially more painful than death itself? Please subscribe to follow this journey. And where are you listening to this story from? The silence in Raymond's life had a weight to it, a heavy blanket he shared with his only companion. Ghost, a 7-year-old German shepherd whose once bright gray and white coat seemed muted by their shared sorrow, walked with his head low, his paws making no sound on the damp earth. For a year since Elena's death, this had been their ritual, a silent pilgrimage through a world that had lost its color. Raymond, a former soldier in his late 30s, with shoulders still broad from service but eyes hollowed by loss, had accepted this quiet existence. He had accepted the doctor's words from long ago, a combat injury that had stolen his future of fatherhood and, he believed, had ultimately pushed Elena away. Their life was a closed loop of grief. They stood before her headstone at the Oregon Military Cemetery, the fine mist of a Tuesday afternoon clinging to the granite. The air was still, heavy with the scent of wet pine and cold stone. And then, the silence shattered. Ghost, who hadn't broken a stride in a year, suddenly went rigid. A low whine escaped his throat before he ripped the leather leash from Raymond's unsuspecting hand and bolted. He ran not with aggression, but with a desperate, single-minded purpose toward a small figure standing alone a few rows over, a boy no older than 5. Raymond's heart seized, but he froze as he watched the impossible happen. The boy, small and thin in a dark blue coat, turned. He had Elena's eyes, a deep shade of hazel that seemed too old for his face. He showed no fear. As the large dog reached him, the boy dropped to his knees and threw his small arms around Ghost's thick neck. "Ghost," he whispered, his voice clear in the misty air, "I knew you would come." Before Raymond could process the words, a man approached. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal overcoat, his silvering hair perfectly combed. This was Harlan Drake, a man whose polite smile never quite reached his cold, appraising eyes. "Leo, you shouldn't wander," he said, his voice smooth but firm. He gently but decisively pulled the boy away from the dog. He gave Raymond a brief nod. "I apologize. He has a vivid imagination. I am his legal guardian." Without another word, he placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and guided him away, leaving Raymond standing in the rain, his world tilted on its axis. He returned home that evening, the heavy blanket of grief now pierced by a single burning question. The drive home was a blur of rain-streaked asphalt and echoing questions. Back inside the small, quiet house that had been his refuge, Raymond found the silence was no longer comforting. It was charged, filled with the image of a small boy and the sound of a name whispered in the rain. He sank into his worn armchair, while Ghost, for the first time in months, refused to settle. The dog paced the wooden floor, his claws making soft, insistent clicks. He would stop, look at Raymond with an unnerving intelligence, and then walk to the corner of the living room, nudging a large, dust-covered cedar chest with his nose. It was Elena's. A piece of her life Raymond had never had the strength to face. After the dog whined for a third time, a low, pleading sound, Raymond finally rose and knelt before it. The hinges creaked as he lifted the heavy lid. The scent of cedar and faint perfume filled the air, a ghost of Elena herself. Inside, nestled amongst her books and sweaters, was a smaller, unmarked box. Raymond's hands trembled as he opened it. His breath caught in his throat. Lying on a bed of tissue paper were baby items. Tiny socks, a silver rattle, and a small hand-knitted sweater, the color of cream. It was impossibly small. The sight made no sense, a painful contradiction to the sterile doctor's report that had defined the end of his marriage and the start of his solitude. Later that night, Unable to sleep, Raymond turned to his laptop. His fingers, once trained for tactical keyboards, flew across the keys. Harlan Drake, New Roots Center. The results were frustratingly flawless. The center's website was a tapestry of smiling children and glowing testimonials from wealthy donors. Drake was praised as a local hero, a savior of abandoned children. The polished perfection of it all felt like a lie, a stark contrast to the cold dismissal in the man's eyes. It was a wall built to keep people out. Discouraged, his eyes fell on the small sweater lying on the table. An idea sparked. He picked it up and held it out to Ghost. The dog, who had been watching him intently, approached cautiously. He sniffed the woolen fabric once, twice. Then, a remarkable change occurred. Ghost's tail gave a tentative wag. He whined, a sound not of grief but of pure, excited recognition, and looked from the sweater to Raymond, his dark eyes asking a clear question. Raymond now knew for certain. The scent on this secret sweater, hidden by his wife, was the same scent that clung to the boy at the grave. Days bled into a week of restless nights and dead ends. Every search for Harlan Drake led to a polished web page or a glowing newspaper article. Raymond was stuck, holding a piece of a puzzle with no picture on the box. He found himself staring at an old photograph on the mantelpiece, one of Elena laughing as a younger Ghost tried to lick her face. He remembered her talking about her thinking spot, a quiet trail that wound through the ancient oak forest bordering the back of the cemetery. It was a place she went to be alone. With nothing but a desperate hunch to guide him, he grabbed Ghost's leash. "Come on, boy," he said, his voice rough. "Let's go for a walk." The air in the forest was different, thick, with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. The ancient oaks formed a dense canopy, dappling the forest floor in a somber green-tinged light. For the first few minutes, Ghost heeled obediently, but as they went deeper, his demeanor changed. His nose, which had been to the ground, lifted. He pulled ahead, no longer following Raymond but leading him with an unnerving certainty. He led him off the main path, through thick ferns, and straight to the base of a massive gnarled oak tree that looked as old as the forest itself. Ghost stopped. He whined once, a sharp, piercing sound, and then he began to dig. He didn't scratch playfully. He dug with a frantic energy, claws tearing at the soil and roots, sending dirt flying. Raymond knelt beside him, his heart pounding against his ribs. He saw the edge of something dark and metallic. Pushing the frantic dog aside gently, he dug with his bare hands, his fingers growing numb from the cold earth until he pulled a small, waterproof metal box from the ground. It was heavy. With trembling hands, he worked the latch open. Inside, protected by a plastic sleeve, was a letter written in Elena's familiar, elegant script. "My dearest Raymond," it began. He read as the forest faded around him, as his world dissolved and reformed with each line. He read about the miracle pregnancy she discovered after he had left, the joy and the terror. He read about Harlan Drake, a man from her past who had become obsessed, a powerful man she feared would stop at nothing to take her child. And then came the final lines. "I had to hide him, my love. Our son, our Leo. I don't know if you will ever find this, but I have to believe you will. Trust Ghost. He knows the way. He will lead you to our son." The letter fell from his numb fingers. The grief in his heart was still there, but now it was forged into something new, something as hard and sharp as steel. The man who returned from the oak forest was not the same one who had entered it. The grief had not vanished, but it had been forged into a weapon, honed by a soldier's resolve. Elena's letter was his mission brief. His objective was clear. He needed undeniable proof, evidence that would stand up in a court of law and tear down the walls Harlan Drake had built around his son. The mourner was gone. The soldier was back. He spent the next day in quiet observation, watching the New Roots Center from a distance, mapping the security cameras, timing the patrols of the single night guard. That evening, he dressed in dark clothing. He looked at Ghost, whose intelligent eyes were fixed on him, sensing the shift in the air. "I need you tonight, boy," Raymond whispered. I need you to be my lookout." Night fell like a shroud over the cheerful facade of the center. The colorful murals of smiling children seemed menacing in the moonlight. Raymond moved through the shadows with a practiced silence, Ghost a gray specter at his side. He found a weak point, a window into a small administrative office at the back of the building. As he worked on the lock with a slim piece of metal, he heard the crunch of gravel. The night guard was making his rounds earlier than expected. Raymond froze and gave a low, two-fingered whistle. From the darkness across the yard, Ghost understood the command. A sudden clatter echoed through the night as a set of metal trash cans was violently knocked over, followed by a sharp, aggressive bark. The guard cursed under his breath, his flashlight beam cutting toward the sound. Away from Raymond, it was the opening he needed. He slipped inside. The building was quiet, smelling of floor polish and something falsely sweet. He moved swiftly to Drake's main office, the lock giving way easily. The room was pristine, orderly, the office of a man obsessed with control. He found the filing cabinet and located the file labeled with Leo's name. He quickly photographed the contents with his phone. The guardianship paper was a blatant forgery. Elena's signature was stiff and unnatural, but it was the drawer next to it that made his blood run cold. It was filled with dozens of other children's files. He saw notations of overseas transfer and humanitarian sponsorship to countries in Eastern Europe and Central America. There were no court orders, no official adoption papers. It was a pipeline. Harlan Drake wasn't saving children, he was selling them. He systematically photographed every damning page before slipping back out the window and disappearing into the night, the evidence burning on his phone. The courtroom was a blur of muted colors and formal language, but Raymond heard only 3 words clearly. Full custody granted. Armed with Elena's heart-wrenching letter and the damning photographs from Drake's files, Raymond's lawyer had systematically dismantled the facade of the New Root Center. Harlan Drake, stripped of his polite veneer, sat stone-faced as the judge spoke of forgery, federal investigation, and abuse of trust. He was led away in handcuffs, a silent end to his reign of deceit. But for Raymond, the victory wasn't in Drake's downfall. It was in the quiet, hopeful drive to the temporary foster home where Leo was waiting. Leo stood on the porch, a small suitcase at his feet. He looked up as Raymond approached, his hazel eyes wide and searching. Raymond knelt down, his heart aching with a love that was both brand new and years old. He didn't need grand words, he just opened his arms. Leo hesitated for only a second before running into the embrace, his small body fitting perfectly against his father's chest. "We're going home," Raymond said, his voice thick with emotion. Their first stop was at a friend's house on the edge of town. As they pulled into the driveway, a familiar gray and white head popped up in the window, followed by an ecstatic bark. When the door opened, Ghost bounded out, a whirlwind of joyous energy. He nudged Raymond's hand before circling Leo, whining happily and licking his face. Leo giggled, a bright, beautiful sound that filled the empty spaces in Raymond's soul. "I told you he'd find me," Leo said, looking up at Raymond with absolute trust. The 3 of them drove home together, a family forged in sorrow and bound by a promise. The next morning they made one last trip to the cemetery. This time there was no rain, only the soft Oregon sunlight filtering through the trees. Leo held a small bouquet of bright wildflowers, and Ghost walked proudly between father and son. They stood before Elena's grave, and Raymond placed a hand on the cool stone. He looked at his son, safe and sound, and at the loyal dog sitting faithfully at the boy's feet. The story had come full circle. This was no longer a place of endings, but of new beginnings. "He's safe, Elena," Raymond whispered to the wind. "Ghost led me home. We're all home." A mother's love can prepare a path, but it is the quiet loyalty of a true friend that shows us the way home. If their journey touched your heart, please subscribe and share your thoughts with us in the comments. Your support helps these stories travel further. You can watch our newest story right now by clicking the video on your screen.